Women's Leadership Initiative at the University of Delaware. My name is Lynn Evans, and I'm the program director. And on behalf of our team, I would like to welcome you to the first in our series. We are facing this unprecedented moment together and finding that we are all impacted by this crisis in different ways. Our hope is that this series will generate insights that help us all to navigate the challenges that we experience and not only manage them, but rise above and provide the kind of leadership that our world needs. We hope that you will be able to join us for the full series. These programs are presented by experts in their fields, and we feel very fortunate that we can offer this level of programming. In today's webinar, we ask that you keep your microphone muted and your audio off. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them into the chat room, and we will continue to monitor that chat room. We will provide time at the end of the session for Q&A, and we will attempt to get to as many of those questions as possible. This morning, we welcome Dr. Marianne Lewis and Dr. Wendy Smith. Dr. Lewis is the Dean of the University of Cincinnati's Lindner School of Business, and she is an international expert on organizational paradoxes. She is joined by Dr. Smith, who is a professor of management at the University of Delaware's Lerner School of Business and Economics. Wendy is also the academic advisor and co-founder of the Women's Leadership Initiative. Wendy and Marianne have been collaborators and colleagues for over 20 years, and together they have become some of the experts studying paradox and both-and thinking. We are thrilled to kick off our session this morning and have them share with us how their research can inform our thinking in this crisis. And with that, I will turn the program over to Wendy. Good morning, Wendy.
Morning. Good morning, everybody. This is Wendy Smith, and it is really fabulous to be here with you all. It's fabulous to look down the list of participants in the participant list and see some old friends and see some new people joining this community. And as Lynn said, it's really this webinar series emerged from the Women's Leadership Initiative as a chance to identify what it is that we are all facing at this moment. We're all facing a real crisis and we're facing it together. And what could we do as an initiative to address that moment? And so I am excited to launch today with some of my research and to be on this call with my good friend and collaborator for I think now 20 years, Marianne Lewis, to share with you some of the research that we've been doing that, and think about how it applies and is appropriate for what we're all facing. I wanted to start off the discussion this morning and ground us in some of the questions that we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks and the dilemmas and challenges that people are facing. In a number of places, we've really been coming up against the types of challenges that and dilemmas that people are asking. And so at the most macro level, I think the fundamental question or challenge that has been asked is, how do we stop the spread of this virus in the short term? How do we halt the progression of it? And at the same time, how do we think about or how do we address long-term implications, both economic, health implications? It's a huge question that people are grappling with at the national level, but also at local and individual levels. And as part of that question, and some of you are on our leading organizations, are in leadership roles, a big piece of that question is who makes those decisions? Who gets to decide, and what decisions are being made more universally and centrally at the top levels? What decisions are more nuanced and specific and more contextualized at the local levels? This question really emerged. I was in an email conversation with a colleague who's a leader at an organization, and early on when we were thinking about how many programs do we shut down, what programs do we shut down before we've halted all programmatic action and all collective community, we were asking the question, like, should we have a more universal stop and shut everything down? Should we be more nuanced in thinking through specific programs? And as this virus progresses, and as some of you are grappling with in your organizations, we have new questions about what actions we should be taking and what actions we shouldn't be taking, and really who should be making those decisions. We also have questions about how we navigate our organizations, both to help the people in our organizations, as well as to think about our core businesses. So in some conversations that we had, we held a forum, a conversation for the alums of our Women's Leadership Forum, which is our executive program. And some of you that are leading businesses and managing other people have been really grappling with this real question of how do we manage business as usual or think about pivoting to the future? And how do we manage the people that are working for us when they're feeling incredibly anxious and we all just don't have answers in this moment? And the other side of that question, or the other piece of that question, is how we offer compassion to the people that are working for us, knowing that we are all facing new realities, working from home, some of the challenges of working from home, certainly those of us with kids managing those challenges of working from home, but at the same time ensuring that people are feeling productive, or people are productive and continuing to do the work. The flip side of that is, as an employee or even as a student, I know we have a bunch of students online, how do we show that we're committed to the work that we're doing, but at the same time navigate all those challenges that we're facing at home and in the novelty of this new situation that we're facing? And then, a fundamental universal challenge that we're facing is, how do we protect ourselves at this moment and reach out to care for the most vulnerable? And certainly we're all grappling with that issue in a variety of different ways. I certainly have been online, so my students in my online class right now have a number of people who are frontline medical workers in healthcare, and that is absolutely a question that is deep and challenging right now in the healthcare industry. I wanted to start there, not to raise our anxieties, but to really notice the number of challenges that have come up over the last couple of weeks that have emerged as we are collectively navigating this pandemic. And I want to just say a couple of things about this. First of all, if you are relating to any of these challenges, any of these core issues, you're not alone. One of the reasons we decided to start this webinar series is to remind ourselves of that fact. And in fact, one of the things that we know from research is that when we face challenges that we're really anxious about or uncertain about, we often narrow in to feel alone. So even though we might cognitively know that the whole world is struggling with this pandemic, oftentimes we feel alone, and the social isolation, not talking to other people or maybe just Zooming with other people, might intensify that. So I just want to start with, you're not alone. We're all grappling with these challenges, and we don't have clear answers to them, which is my second point, which is that these are a lot of big questions, and we are not going to address all of these questions in the next hour. In fact, these are really big questions that we're not going to be able to address necessarily in the, that are going to be open and real questions that we're going to be grappling with in the next several weeks. But what we want to offer in this webinar and in the next hour is a perspective of how to think about these issues and bring to light some of the research that Marianne and I have been doing, which is not about how to solve specific issues, but really how to think about specific issues, or how to think about these kinds of dilemmas that we face. Because what we know is that underlying these issues, each of them, is what we think about as a core tension or a competing demand. We're navigating, or we're struggling with issues of short-term versus long-term thinking, of questioning decision-making that's more centralized or decentralized, of dealing with both certainty and uncertainty, of navigating our businesses to deal with stability, continuing to do the things that we've done, our existing world, and also change, of thinking about how we provide both authority and leadership that's conclusive, but also democracy or leadership that is enabling of other people to do what they need to do. Many of us are grappling with the fundamental tension of work and life. And at the core of this question of protect ourselves versus be there for others is a real fundamental challenge of taking care of ourselves versus taking care of the other, self versus other. And as we've seen in our research, as we've seen in our conversations in talking with people, these core tensions are universal. While they've really popped up, while they've really been triggered and fueled by this pandemic, by this crisis, while more of them are coming up for us to grapple with, these really are universal tensions that we experience throughout our lives and that don't go away. And so if we're going to offer, what we want to do is offer a way to think about them. What I want to start out with is to explore how we typically think about these tensions, our sort of typical approach. Because what we find and what we know in our research is that when we face these kinds of competing demands, tensions, things that feel like they're directly in conflict with one another, we frame them as a trade-off, as a dilemma in which we have to see them as an either or. And so we frame them as a trade-off, we weigh the options, we make a decision, and then we try to be consistent, or at least, as research will say, we value ourselves and others when we are consistent in these tensions. And so we think about that as an either or response. That response is one, again, where we frame either or questions, we adopt consistent approaches. It is often driven by a space of managing our emotions. So one of the things that we know and that psychoanalysis has told us for a long time, and neurobiology is now starting to really provide the evidence, is that our decision making is incredibly reinforced by or led by our emotions rather than our rational thinking. And so we act on these emotions to make these either or decisions. When we face uncertainty and have a question, how should we navigate this virus? What should we shut down? It's a lot of anxiety that we face. The uncertainty raises anxiety. And we want to make decisions quickly or as quickly as possible to feel like we are back in control to minimize the anxiety. Some of you might have felt this when there was big open questions several weeks ago before we hit the sort of halt everything and stay at home moment of what to do about programs, how you should live. And you may have even felt it as soon as those decisions were made, either by you or by someone else. It was almost a sense of, relief that the uncertainty was closed, that the anxiety was minimized because now you had a decision, and that decision creates a bit of relief. Not only are these kinds of open uncertainties anxiety provoking, when we make a decision, once we've decided something, we also then get defensive to hold or to reinforce or to argue for that decision, and that defensiveness kicks in to keep us in the decision that we've made. So these emotions really drive us into this either or approach. And the other thing that drives us is a need for both stability and predictability. For those of you who have raised kids know that routines are really helpful. They reduce our anxiety, they reduce our discomfort. We like things to be stable and predictable, and truly those approaches are valuable, or are normal approaches, but they're somewhat problematic in several ways. The first is that when we make decisions to pick one side of these competing demands, ultimately what happens is that they trigger the other side. So this image here is an image of what's called the Newtonian balls, and you may have all seen how this works. You pull one side of these balls, and then as you let go and it flies back, the momentum works through the balls and kicks up to the other side. That metaphor, the same is true about our decision making when we make decisions facing these competing ideas. If we make decisions that focus us, or if we're navigating, for example, the tension between who makes decisions, are they centralized and universal, or are they more decentralized, nuanced, and more local? What we find is that if we focus on and overemphasize centralization, what we have is a number of local, distinct situations that don't fit into that universal and centralized situation. And we have either people disengaging, or we have, especially if we're in a crisis and trying to get people to pivot and navigate quickly and respond quickly, we've minimized the ability for people to respond quickly because they feel paralyzed to not be able to make decisions locally. But at the same time, if we overemphasize local decision making, and we have seen this, then what we end up with is a lot of what we need in this crisis is a universal approach where we can, in a unified way, push forward. And if we're making all of these local decisions, we lack that sense of unity, and everybody therefore is going off on their own direction, and we no longer have an approach that's going to be effective. And so in this sort of centralized, decentralized way, we really can't just choose one or the other. You know, for those of you that aren't leading organizations, I know we have some students online, I know that we have some other folks online, that those of you that aren't in a leadership position and making those kinds of decisions, we're all navigating, for example, the decision about in our own lives, this question of protect ourselves and do everything to self-protect, or reach out and really be available and take care of the other, the most vulnerable. And so too, if we just go to the place of only protecting ourselves, first we lose contact with others, and then ultimately and ironically, we create this sense of social isolation that actually is detrimental to ourselves. We know that from the research, caring for, reaching out to others is actually quite helpful in helping ourselves. And at the same time, we also lose that if we go too far to protecting the other, we create detriment to ourselves. There's a famous philosophical quote that I love to share in this moment that goes, if I am for myself, or if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, who am I? And so what we see is that if we go down the road of this either or thinking, we end up in this kind of vicious cycle that's more detrimental, that's more narrow, that leads us to a place that limits our potential to really be out there, creative, generative, and supporting and sustainable over time. And so again, what we see is that this is a natural approach. We all do it, but that it can be limited at best or really detrimental at worst. The alternative is to think about, or what we think about is these tensions, not just as competing demands, but what we label as paradox with this yin-yang symbol. And the reason that we label this as paradox is because these alternative competing demands, centralization, decentralization, short-term, long-term, self, other, all of these are not just in conflict with each other and contradictory, they're also interdependent. They define each other. They are mutually reinforcing. And because of that, they persist over time. They never go away. So even as we make a decision now about how we're going to progress forward in terms of our businesses or in terms of our lives, the underlying tension, today versus tomorrow, short-term versus long-term, centralized versus decentralized, those self versus other, those never go away. They persist over time. And so what I want to do, and by the way, these are universal. So this comes from a piece that Marianne and I wrote in the Harvard Business Review, where we talk about the universality of these types of tensions and how they show up in different situations. So again, reinforcing and stressing that we're not alone, we are all in this together, and these tensions aren't new in this crisis, it's just that this crisis has magnified and amplified them. So what I want to do is turn this over to Marianne, because the question is, if not the either or option, what's the alternative? And our alternative is a both and option. And so the question is, what does that mean and how do we implement that? So Marianne, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think to add to the you're not alone, we're all in this together, we can now shift to a both and approach, and that there are real opportunities in this space of tension. And to navigate these tensions, to make the most of these opportunities, what we've found is a series of quite interwoven efforts in a both and approach that make an enormous difference to help us not only learn and live through these tensions, but actually thrive. And we begin that view with a focus on our underlying assumptions and really the need to change the question, shift the way that we're thinking about the core issue. In this regard, I often think of Watzlawick and his colleagues who were renowned psychologists at Stanford many years ago. And they quipped, the problem is not the problem is the way we think about the problem. The reason why assumptions are so key in terms of our underlying question is if we are assuming there is a universal truth, there is a correct answer, there is a winner and a loser, this is a zero-sum game, we will always go back to the either or. That becomes the hammer and everything is a nail. What we'd like to encourage us all to think more about is the and, a shift in our underlying assumptions to look for why these elements, yes, are pulling us in opposing directions, but also, as Wendy said, interwoven. A study that I often think about in this regard is a work that I did in the early 2000s with my colleague Lotte Luscher in Denmark. We were studying Lego when they had just undergone a massive reorganization, slicing out about a third of their middle managers. And we came in to work with production managers who were now managers of self-managed teams. And these people, and they were all fellows, these guys were all saying, I have no idea what that means. So am I supposed to supervise and lead and be responsible of our targets? Or am I supposed to be creating a team and enhancing our teamwork, our collaboration, and our innovation? Now, through quite a bit of work together, they ended up shifting their focus much more toward a question of how do we co-create collaborative, innovative, high-performing teams? Now, if we look towards today, and the kind of questions that we're asking, and Wendy posed a number of them at the beginning. I'll give you an example of, I saw this in play yesterday as an example. I was talking with one of the partners of 8451, which is a tremendous market analytics firm here in Cincinnati, whose largest client is Kroger retailing. And this leader was telling me that when earlier in the crisis, the leadership was struggling and saying, well, those of us focused on Kroger are really going to have to buckle down, make sure that we're helping flatten the curve and support Kroger's efforts in doing that. And they assumed that others could likely either be stagnant or worse, actually need to be furloughed. And he said what he found is that they used this as an opportunity for remarkable creativity, shifted a very large chunk of their workforce away from their typical approach to Kroger, which is really the consumer-oriented focus, what is pricing, what's on the shelves, how do we manage, to the supply chain, and a much different emphasis. And in doing so, not only did they keep everybody working, they're helping Kroger do better in managing, getting things onto the shelf, the whole supply chain. But in the long term, they're going to make 8451 stronger because they have just diversified and grown their capabilities as well as deepened their partnership with Kroger. So it's wonderful to see that sort of example. If we go to the second step, I want to think about the boundaries of paradox. And we do love the yin-yang. It is a truly powerful symbol of what we're talking about. And the boundaries are both between the opposing elements as well as around those elements. And we want to find that people who thrive with paradox think to separate and integrate those elements. So when we say separate, we mean pull apart the opposing sides, understand, deepen our value, our appreciation, and our capabilities on the opposing sides. That's the separation. And at the same time, think about how they fit together. Build a holistic view that pulls together the opposing sides and emphasizes their synergies. In research that I did with a colleague of mine, Kostas Andriopoulos, we were studying product design firms in Silicon Valley. And we found this worked quite well for the product designers themselves. There were really two different kinds of projects that they could be working on, and they felt this continuously as this tug of war. On the one hand, there were products or projects that were bold and exciting. These were the ones that they got into this business of being a designer for, what they could win award for. It really woke them up and got them excited. They were radical. And on the other side, we call them 2.0 projects, right? There are these projects with repeat customers that pay the bills and get things done. Well, the designers found, and their leadership helped them work through this as they all started to identify it, that living only on these frame-breaking radical projects is exhausting. It takes everything they have, it drains the individual, and at the same time, if you're too focused on the 2.0 projects, they're demoralizing, they end up leading to people departing the firm. So what they built was, one, an appreciation for why they needed both types of projects, not only for the firm, but also for themselves. And they built more of an identity that held them together, an integrating identity where across these firms, designers increasingly, and they would use different language, called themselves practical artists. They saw the two pieces fitting together, and it shifted their approach. I would say the same is true today in this pandemic. If we think about kind of our own lives, on the one hand, I mean, I'm sitting in my office. The boundaries that we have always held between work and family, work and life, work and social, they're kind of disappearing. And what I would encourage us to think about is we need boundaries. It helps to compartmentalize. It enables focus. It also enables appreciation of the different sides as well as how they fit together. And through their actual fitting together is how we see our meaning and the integrative purpose that is our lives. So how do we separate and connect? If we go to the next element, we return to the idea of emotions. And as Wendy said, emotions can be a great ally or extremely detrimental to the way we make decisions and act. When we think about paradoxes, what we want to encourage, and we find repeatedly in our research, is the need to find comfort in this discomfort. My Chinese colleagues often remind me that the word for crisis is made up of two elements, both danger and opportunity. And that's the world that we live in. In these very discomforting times, there's also the opportunity for creative friction, for a space within these challenges to find new possibilities. Brené Brown's research, I often think about in this regard. In Daring Greatly, which is one of my favorite books of hers, she writes about the double-sided coin of courage and vulnerability, and that it is in our most challenging times, when we feel our most vulnerable, that we have the greatest opportunity for courage, for finding ourselves, for finding what we're made of, and for learning it up a very steep curve. Today, certainly COVID-19, it is highly uncomfortable, it's strain, it's challenging every day. But I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing, which is remarkable creativity, collaboration, innovation of individuals and of groups. And in this space, we will find ourselves developing new opportunities. I see it here in Cincinnati and globally. The entrepreneurial ecosystem is on hyperdrive. That's an opportunity. And I'm not saying this isn't a catastrophic situation, but there are valuable options in play as we go. The last element I would stress is the need for dynamism. Wendy and I have written quite a bit on the need to be dynamic. And when I say dynamic, we like the metaphor of the tightrope walker. Because if you look at this picture here and just think about what it takes to walk a tightrope, have not done it, cannot say I've done it, right? But the key is that you keep looking ahead and you keep moving. If you stop, you fall. If you over compensate to one side or the other, you fall. So how do you continue to experiment and be adaptive? That's what we mean by dynamism. One of my favorite studies of Wendy's, and she's done so many, is an early study of hers with IBM's top management teams. And what she found is that they were really challenged by a tension between needing to focus on their core product and leading in their markets today, and looking at how are we going to create the next market? What radical innovation are we going to do? And where are we going to put our resources, our time, our energy, our money? What she found in studying these top teams is not only was this not an either or, because clearly they had to be focused on both today and tomorrow, but it also wasn't big chunks, like we're strictly going to focus on today and then we're going to shift to tomorrow. What she found was a more micro balancing, that they were continuously experimenting, improvising, seeing what worked in today and how did it shift towards an opportunity for tomorrow. Likewise, as they were building radical R&D, basic research, they would find opportunities that they could build into today's product. So through micro shifts between current products and tomorrow's products, and this innovation, improvisational iteration that they were doing between the two, they not only stayed flexible and adaptive, but they continued to move forward. When I see that myself today, and I'm speaking particularly from my dean's role, but I know Wendy and our colleagues at Delaware are seeing it as well. I mean, I look in the last few weeks at converting over 550 courses and all of our academic advising and career coaching to remote. What I see is this continuous microbalancing. And at our best, what we're going to do is learn through this in a way that we've never dreamed possible. The slide you're seeing now starts to put together what we think of as the alphabet of a paradox approach. How do we think about our assumptions? Make more of our boundaries, leverage them, find comfort in the discomfort, and stay dynamic. Work that we've done with our colleagues, Ella Myron Spectrum, Amy Ingram, and Josh Keller, has focused on building out an approach, a measure to looking at a paradox mindset, and then starting to study at scale. How do people develop the paradox mindset? What are its approaches? And we're very quickly seeing in our findings that those individuals, teams, and organizations who apply a paradox mindset, the both-and approach, are more likely to be more satisfied in their work, more productive, and more innovative. And those are big statements, and we'll continue to test them. But I think I return to today and the work that we're in. We're all going to learn more through this process, through these challenges, than we ever imagined possible. And I hope that the both-and insights that we're sharing can encourage you to make the most of the challenges, as odd as that may sound, because that is the space that we're in. So Wendy, why don't I turn it back over to you, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne, and thanks all. First of all, I just want to reinforce that these are indeed tensions, challenges that we all face. So, just acknowledge that one challenge that we're all facing at this moment as a novel challenge is the tension of inclusivity, exclusivity as we navigate these Zoom rooms. So we want to be as inclusive as possible, and yet inclusive sometimes means letting in the wrong people. So thank you for walking through that moment with us. What I want to do before we turn over to some Q&A is just invite you all, as you're thinking about these issues, to reflect for a moment. What are some of the core tensions, challenges, either ors that you're feeling? What are some of the possible both ands that you could make out of that? Just invite you to reflect in on your challenges, your questions, your dilemmas that you're feeling at whatever level that you're at. Put them up in the chat room, and then we'll field questions. I know that we've been collecting questions from the chat room and just enter into and open up a conversation. So take a minute and put your questions or your dilemmas or your challenges in the chat room, and then we'll open up to some questions.
Let me start with one that has come from a participant from the Women's Leadership Forum, who said she was grappling with this, either or approach in a dilemma in within her work, within her team, and she worked through it. And what she's asking is, it does make sense. Clearly it's hard to do. It's not natural to us. So what would you recommend as the first step in keeping what you've just talked about? How do you keep that in mind and move forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one that we're all challenged with. I think that when we do these kinds of talks, and we do them all over the place, one of the things that we find is people say, yeah, that totally makes sense. I get it. How do I do it? And what I like to say is that really the first piece of how to do it is really what the first thing that we're recommending, which is change the question. That if we frame a question as an either-or question, we will ultimately end up with an either-or answer. So if we're in a space to say, oh, should we be focused on the short term or the long term, the first piece is to reframe the question to how can I do A and B? And just reframing the question is really generative of new insights. Marianne was talking about what that looked like at Lego, and what it's sort of an invitation to act in a new way. What that looked like at Lego, our colleague Ella Marone-Spector, who Marianne had mentioned, had a great study where she brought people into a laboratory. She invited them to think about the underlying paradoxical tension of creativity. To be creative, you both have to be novel, come up with something radical and new, but also incredibly useful. So how do you navigate that tension between novelty and usefulness? And told half of the people in the study, look, novelty and usefulness are in conflict with each other. Something that's really, really, really radical and novel is often not that useful, and vice versa. And then told the other half of the people, novelty and usefulness are really in conflict with each other. How can you accommodate both simultaneously? And by doing that, just changing the question for people, the people for whom she asked, how can you do both? You've got to do both. How can you do both even though they're in conflict? Came up with radically new, novel ideas of how to approach this creative challenge, this creative task. And so that's the question, that's the issue, which is if we start by just changing the question, we had this experience, both Marianne and I, where we were talking about the long-term, short-term navigation of this virus. And we both put out a point of view that said, look, we've really got to buckle down and focus on the short term, but we cannot do it at the expense of the economic, health, social impacts of the long-term isolation. How do we accommodate both simultaneously? And we got a lot of pushback from that, saying that we're not being caring to people, that we're not accommodating, that we're not thinking about all of the real crisis in the short term. And the truth is we are. Absolutely. The short-term crisis is critical, and we have to be thinking about the long term. So if we change the question to be how can we do both, it opens up all kinds of new possibilities. Marianne, what?
Well, I was just going to, I think to the point about the example you just shared is a really important one. We said that people's defensiveness, our own and those that are listening to us or responding to us, can absolutely reinforce this either or. I mean, I find it on a daily basis in research, but also in my leadership, is you can say but people will typically hear you saying not the one that they want. It's an interesting approach. It's really counterproductive. So as Wendy was saying in terms of the virus, right? So if I'm looking long term, somebody can say, don't you care? And it's like, no, I never said that. I'm saying actually to care for the short term, I also want to make sure that we're thinking for the long term. And by the way, in thinking for the long term, I don't want to make decisions that hurt us in the short term. It does shift the question, but it really does push us to be much more creative in that effort.
Marianne, here's another question, and I think is related to your comment there. It says, I love the idea of creating boundaries between work and the rest of my life, particularly during this time. However, my manager does not have the same boundaries. How do you suggest I address that issue?
Oh, it's a really good question. I was actually talking to my daughter about this one recently. She said something very similar. In a perfect world, it's a both and that you're working on it as well as your manager, and you're figuring out creatively how to build these boundaries. And I would say that if if the boundaries are really non-existent in your work or with your manager, and you don't seem to be able to have productive conversations about how to build them, I still firmly believe you can create your own boundaries. They might not be ideal, but you can start to kind of push your own space. Think about what you have on your desk. I mean, unless you have I hope you don't have someone literally sitting over your shoulder. It's how do you compartmentalize even small blocks of time? How do you think about your email versus, right? I mean, there's very creative ways. There are a million time management books. I don't know that I would put a lot of, heft into all of those kind of ideas, but one of the themes that you see quite a bit in project management books or time management books is compartmentalizing your time. And it doesn't have to be up to someone else. It's your time. And
I want to, oh,
yeah, go ahead.
I want to add to that as well, because I think that that's right. One of the things that we find, or certainly that I find when I do sessions on leadership and managing, is this very question of like, what happens when my leader isn't managing the same way that I want to be managed? And sort of it's the same question. It's a broader question. I was actually just on a similar kind of webinar yesterday with Amy Edmondson, who was talking about psychological safety, and the same question came up. Like, how do we, what do we do if our leaders aren't creating the culture of psychological safety that we want? What do we do if our leaders aren't creating the both and culture that we want and that we want to accommodate? What do we do if our leaders aren't accommodating our needs for this tension between work at home versus work, And this is where I think it's a real question of leadership, which is that leadership is a both and. It's a question of what is in my sphere of influence and what is outside of my sphere of influence. So what is the responsibility of my leader and what is my responsibility? And the things that are my responsibility, I have influence and control over. And how can I take that and both expand it and manage up and help my leader sort of see otherwise? So I think it's a little bit of a both and of getting things done is about both asserting ourselves and, it's both our leader's responsibility and it's about our responsibility or our sphere of influence.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. Marianne, this has come in specifically for you. As Dean of a business school, in that leadership, very important leadership role, how have you seen these kinds of paradoxical tensions emerge? And how have you been able to apply this kind of both and approach?
I mean, I see them every day. I think we all do. We just, because I've been studying it for 20 years, I seem to see them in my sleep and under my bed and all sorts of places. But I mean, I'll give you an example that I'm working on today, right? Today we're building contingency plans for the summer and the fall. And I started back as dean at the University of Cincinnati in July, and have spent the last 6 months building a vision for the future. And so here I have an immediate issue as well as the future. So, and everybody does this maybe in a different way, but so in this contingency plan, I've got on one side everything for the immediate, and then I've got the long-term vision on the other side. Because what I want to be clear with everybody, but starting with myself, is I do not want to make a decision in the short term that contradicts or undermines the vision of the long term. And likewise, I think as I'm looking at the short term, it's a test. Is that the right vision? Right? We've spent all this time building it, but this is the perfect storm, I suppose, litmus test. So in that way, it's both the short and long term. I mean, the other tension I think many of us can envision here goes back to that last question. I mean, when I think about faculty, or you could put yourself in a student's position or others, is how do we build the systems, the structure, and the expectations that help people thrive in their multiple competing roles? So when I talk about a faculty, I'm talking about the classic research, teaching, and service, but think about your own competing roles. I love Iris Benet's book, How It Works, because one of the things that she's really talking about in this book is how do you build systems and structures at an organizational level that empower people to thrive in their different roles. I'm not saying this is easy, but the only way it can happen is if you're building those structures with all of the roles in mind. Because if you build them with only one or two, I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. You will ensure that you've built an either or system.
This question just came in. I think it's terrific. It says, is the both and approach always the best? Or are there circumstances, paraphrasing here, where either or might be the better option?
Wendy?
So thank you. I think it was Pat who put that question in. So thank you, Pat, for raising that. In some ways we think about this as moving from paradox 1.0 to paradox 2.0. And here's what I mean. We, in fact, as you might have noticed, have set up a bit of an either or between an either or approach and a both and approach. And we are advocating for a both and approach in conflict with, or as opposed to an either or. Okay, so that might be paradox 1.0, which is that take us from the place where we tend to think about things as an either or, that's our first gut defensive approach, and move us to a place where we can think about a both and approach more often, because it's the one that we use less and the one that's less natural to us. That's paradox 1.0. We think about paradox 2.0 as, okay, well now how do we accommodate both either or and both and in our approaches and in our decision making? And so here's what I mean by that specifically. In fact, Marianne was talking about the IBM study that I did. So what I went in thinking was that if they're going to do this both and between, and for them it was today and tomorrow, they were navigating a whole set of innovation and technology changes around the time when we were introducing all of this web and cloud technology, but at the same time trying to keep the wheels running on their current car. I was expecting to find that both and means we find these great synergies, this great like integrative synergy where things work all well together. And as Marianne said, that's not actually what happened. That's not how they navigated both and. The way that they were managing both and was actually making these micro either or decisions in service of the bigger both and. So as she said, sometimes they were taking resources and putting it into today and sometimes tomorrow. And shifting them very quickly back and forth, the same way that the tightrope walker gets forward by making these micro iterations between left and right, but is never fully stable in the middle. It's not like there's this perfect synergy. And so there's either or decisions, there's real choices to be made in service of the bigger both and. It's the same thing. I think there was another comment or question that I saw about, we have to make some real choices in the moment for those of us working from home about whether we're focused on our kids or focused on work. And again, if we think about those as micro choices, right? Like this hour, I'm sitting with all of you on this webinar, and thankfully my husband is home and taking care of my kids and their school needs at this moment. And as I get off, I will swap and do something in the next hour. Or actually what our arrangement has been is this day is my work day, this day is his work day. And so I am not sitting and trying to manage my kids' school at the same time that I'm on this webinar with you. It's all one perfect synergy. I'm making micro choices and micro decisions that are in service of the bigger both and. So in some ways, the question of is there either or is that paradox 2.0 says, in fact, both anding is about a lot of choice making. It's about, however, what we talk about as being consistently inconsistent rather than consistently consistent. So Marianne, what would you add?
No, I think it's a very important to see that it is both. It is the either or, that we have decisions all the time in our lives that are simple, straightforward, weigh the pros and cons of the different sides and pick it. But if the tension is between elements that are contradictory, interdependent, and don't go away, you need a both and approach. And so what we hope is that this framework that we're providing builds some habits so that we start questioning, what is this tension? What are we looking at? And what kind of approach does it need? And then thinking through the assumptions, the boundaries, the comfort, and the dynamism.
And I think, again, so as I look down the list of who's online and notice a bunch of your names, a bunch of you are navigating these kinds of real questions in the moment. Things like, how do I navigate, becoming a teacher and homeschooling at the same time as continuing my work? Some of you are asking those same questions about leading your organizations. There's some leaders on the phone. There's some people at the top of your organizations. And it's the same kind of question about how do we manage business as usual and at at the same time pivot to be able to address and accommodate a whole new reality that we're walking into, a whole new economic reality, a whole new reality, a whole new market reality, industry reality. You know, it's the same question, by the way. I know some of you are navigating this real question about either you're students and you're looking to head into the job market, or you're in the job market and you're wondering about what the future of your employment looks like. It's the same question there, which is how do you experiment, try new things to be able to walk into a new job market and shift along the way and pivot along the way to try and accommodate this new reality, and at the same time continue to do the things that you've always known are the right things to do. You've got to do both.
And so, Wendy, what I hear you saying in terms of this is not an either or. We are not in a crisis situation that we have to manage in a certain way, whether it's home or work. But this is going to be our new reality, is that inconsistency. So these are the ways of behaving and the ways of dealing with each other that we will carry forward, whatever that new reality is. That may not be long lasting either. It is always going to be shifting. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And in fact, look, I think we are in a crisis situation globally. And I think that crisis situation, Lynn, as you're pointing out, really does magnify the reality of the way that we work, or we should work anyway. So Marianne and I have been sort of beating the drum, if you will, that a both and approach is actually really good practice for business as usual. It keeps you fresh, it keeps you dynamic, it keeps you sustainable, it keeps you creative, it keeps you generative, it keeps you thriving, it keeps your people thriving. And like even the more so now when we're amidst like real crisis, and that crisis, as Lynn, you're saying, is a new normal that we're going to be navigating. Folks, this isn't a short-term issue. We're not going to finish this pandemic and be done in the next couple of weeks. We're in it for the long haul. And if we're in it for the long haul, we've got to be in it together, and we've got to be in it in a much more creative and sustainable way.
Thank you, Wendy and Marianne. I know that we could go on. I would love to continue this conversation, but it looks like we are just about at the end of our hour. I'd also like to thank both of you for your composure and your professionalism. I have taken that out of this hour as well. We hope that those of you who have joined us have found it to be very beneficial and an insightful presentation. I know that I have. And I hope that it will prompt you to join us for the rest of the series. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks on the 17th, and we have that up on the screen now. It will be hosted by Sarah Andrus at the University of Delaware and Golby Kamerai. And what they will tackle is mindfulness, how we stay grounded and more effectively enable us to navigate the challenges that we face. And I'm really looking forward to their presentations as well. I know that a lot of you have more questions. Please reach out to us. Women's Leadership at udel.edu. There you see various ways that you can reach us through social media. And I would encourage you to do so, and we will make every attempt to get back to you. Also, please look for a survey in your inbox. It's really important to us that we hear from you, that we get your feedback, and we continue to improve on the programming that we offer. And with that, I will wish you a great rest of the day, and I hope to see all of you in 2 weeks. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.